What about the role of the defense ministry and the armed services, right? Because Prabowo was a general, deep connections to the military, was defense minister. Months before the trip to Beijing, we saw the standoff with the Chinese Coast Guard over the new drilling operations in the North Natuna Sea, in which the Indonesian Navy and Bakamla did this really unusual for Indonesia thing of releasing like 2 weeks worth of video and photos showing, documenting the Chinese bad behavior. And it was suggested to me that that was the Navy kind of testing the waters with the new president to see what they could get away with. And what they got away with apparently was doing that for 2 weeks before anybody told them to stop, which is probably a week and a half longer than Jacoby would have let it go. What do we make of that component of the influence from the government to Prabowo?
Well, there is certainly a wider unresolved tension, I would say, if not consternation within the defense establishment going back to his time as defense minister, because the way that Prabowo had preferred to do things is that he gets to tell the armed services what to buy, for example, in terms of procurement. And for a long time, the practice is the reverse, right? Each of the services get to determine their own procurement plan. So there is a bit of some consternation around how procurement is done. And of course, the kind of inter-service rivalry between the Army Special Forces and the rest of the establishment, whether it's Navy, Air Force, or the wider Army, is also there. So the preference for Prabowo, for example, to elevate the Army Special Forces guys into key positions is certainly a part of that tension. And that, I think, has continued on to the administration. But whether or not that directly and immediately shaped the response is not entirely clear to me, because there's also an unresolved tension between Navy and Bakamla, as well as others. So I tend to see it less about the Navy testing the new administration as much as I think both the Navy and Bakamla wanted to prove their worth to the administration. Because let's be honest, all of this were taking place in the middle of the so-called retreat of the incoming cabinet ministers at the military academy. Nobody is going to play a command central room and direct these massive engagement and campaign from the middle of the military academy. So I'm not convinced that there was a strategic preconceived plan coming from the top of the administration. I think it was a reaction from folks on the ground, or I guess on the water at the time, and whether or not this relates to the broader need to prove their worth to the incoming administration. I do think that right now there is a, perhaps for lack of a better term, a fear factor within the defense establishment where, yes, we may disagree with how things are being told to us in terms of procurement, in terms of policy and all of these things, but there is no way that we are going to challenge the president's authority. And so I feel like the way that this particular government is run more broadly, not just in terms of the defense establishment, it's ultimately a special forces regime, how the discipline is imposed, how the structure is designed. And so I feel like the role of the army in particular will grow, certainly in a weird way, to compensate for what they perceive as losses against the police over the last 10 years under Jokowi, who had seemed to be favoring the police a little bit. And so I feel like in the process of this tension, Indonesia's hard-earned democratic civil and military relations over the last 20 years will be eroded in the process.
It sounds like the pieces haven't quite fallen into place. Or maybe they have, and is this the new normal for Indonesia for the next few years? And if it is that necessarily such a bad thing, given some of the other examples of running a government that we've seen elsewhere? And we all know who I'm talking about. So, I mean, is this part of a larger trend? And if so, is this something that we should be gearing ourselves for the longer run?
I think certainly Prabowo, just like some other administration, is not a blip. I think this is a part of a longer trend. In Indonesia, the trend of lack of trust in political parties and governance, and therefore necessitating the creation, for lack of better terms, a parallel government backed and executed by security establishment, is not unusual in Indonesia's history. But I think the demand for it has grown a little bit for the last 5-10 years. Whether or not Indonesia's sort of broader democratic institutions can be twisted and turned going back to the New Order days may be a bit too far. But I do think it wouldn't be because of lack of trying. I think it's just the necessary competence to actually do that is not very straightforward. People forget under Suharto, despite the military-backed authoritarian rules, Suharto also relied on a lot of experts and competent people who run the country, which I'm not sure that's readily available today for Indonesia. So for me, I think the chaos of the first 3 months of the administration, particularly with these kinds of budget cuts and new sovereign wealth funds and what have you, shortcuts and changing the rules if it doesn't suit you, I think will be the new normal.